evening, everybody. My name is Mark Schlechter. I'm an attorney from Steuben County, Bath, New York, and I want to thank everybody for showing up tonight. It's always somewhat difficult to organize events in January, but I'm so glad everybody was able to come out here today. I'd like to thank the sponsors, first of all. It's the Coalition to Protect New York, People for a Healthy Environment, and the Committee to Preserve the Finger Lakes. I understand that as part of this event, Steuben, Chemung, and Schuyler County officials were invited to attend. So, by a show of hands, are there any such officials here today? I'd like to acknowledge you. Okay, where are you guys from?
The office of Assemblyman Christopher Fred.
Okay, great.
First, come on, kind of legislature, Galway.
Okay, thank you. Anybody else? Someone else raise their hand back there?
I'm the Scott County Environmental Management Council and the Planning Commission and Town Planning Board for Reading.
Okay, great. Okay, that's fantastic. It's always important to get as many public officials here as possible to try to get the information out as best we can. There's a bit of a change in the program. Rather than David Slotje, who's an attorney who's going to be speaking later, Helen Slotje is going to be speaking after our featured speaker. Now, most of the, I've attended and been part of a lot of forums dealing with high-volume hydraulic fracturing, and most of them have involved geologists and scientists and teachers and environmental experts, all talking about the damage to the land and the severe public health impact that hydrofracking has had in communities all throughout the country. There hasn't really been that much focus, as far as my experiences have come into effect, is on economics. And it always seems to me that when dealing with money and economics, you're dealing with things from the industry, on the industry's turf. All right, that's their kind of bailiwick. So when people raise issues like contaminated drinking water or water pollution, air pollution, documented cases of illnesses near drilling sites and destruction of our ecosystem, the industry response is always the same, right? It's money and jobs, money and jobs, money and jobs. That's the mantra. And in fact, today, the New York State Bar Association Journal, I saw, has an article called "The Marcellus Shale, a Game Changer for New York Economy." So that's what the industry likes to talk about. But as is true with so many issues, when you're looking at hydrofracking, the more you learn, the more questions you ask. And we're fortunate today to have someone like Deborah Rogers, who is going around raising these kinds of economic questions. And with her vast knowledge of economics and with her direct experience with the Barnett Shale, which is the formation, the shale formation with really the longest track record of drilling anywhere in the country, she's in a very unique position to say to us, whenever an industry says high profits, low risk, that's when you have to be aware. You have to be warned. Because if things like that, high risk, low risk, high profits, remind you of things like Enron or AIG or maybe German Madoff, I think you're on the right track. Deborah Rogers began her financial career in London working in corporate finance, specifically venture capital, my old job. When she returned to the U.S., she worked as a financial consultant with several major Wall Street firms, and in 2003 she left Wall Street and founded her own cheese-making operation, establishing her company as one of the premier artisanal cheese dairies in the United States. She then became involved in natural gas issues when she learned that an energy company was planning to drill high-impact wells right next to her property. After her efforts to insist on testing the impacts of this drilling, she began speaking out on the financial anomalies, her expertise regarding the economics of shale gas extraction. Ms. Rogers started Energy Policy Forum, which is the preeminent website and blog for discussing the complex problems inherent in shale gas. She has served on the Advisory Council for the Federal Reserve Bank of Dallas since 2008. And in 2011, she was appointed by the Texas Commission on Environmental Quality to a task force reviewing the placement of monitors in the Barnett Shale region. She recently joined the Regional Steering Committee for the Oil and Gas Accountability Project. And in June 2011, she was prominently featured in a New York Times article questioning the economics of shale gas, with her picture very prominently displayed right next to CEO of Chesapeake, Barbara McClendon. And I had fun talking about that picture earlier tonight. For those who don't think those credentials are enough to show how passionate she is about the economics of fracturing, remember she's from Texas, and she chose to engage in a major speaking tour of upstate New York in the middle of winter. So I'd like you all to give a warm welcome with the emphasis on warm to
Thank you. Can everybody hear me all right? Yes? Okay. Someone just told me they heard me last night in Ithaca, and I'm sorry, you're going to hear the same presentation, you're going to hear the same intro here. But I'd like to tell you a little bit louder, okay? Is this a little bit better? Yes. Yeah, I need to be closer. How about if I just, so when my plane arrived last Sunday night, the captain announced that it was 7 degrees outside. And I literally sat there and I thought, I don't have to get off this plane. And then I braved it and I got off and I got my bag and I went out and I got the rental car and everything. And of course it was dark and it was blowing a gale and freezing. And so I was trying to get everything. I couldn't get the trunk open and finally I hit the button to unlock the doors and I heard the doors unlocked and I pulled the handle and nothing happened. And you have to understand that this is not part of my worldview in Texas. And so I stood there for a minute and I thought, what's the deal? And then it hit me. So I yanked really hard and of course snap, crackle, pop, the door opened. And I literally thought to myself, Lord Deborah, you are not in Kansas anymore. So, if you don't mind, I'm wearing my leather jacket and I intend to keep it on. Yeah. In fact, I've slept it. No. Okay, is that better? Oh, we got. Okay, so I was featured, as he just said, change the slide, please, in New York Times article exposing the anomalies of shale gas production last summer. And at that time, you may recall that the New York Times was pretty much vilified, as was I, by industry for that particular story. However, a few weeks later, due to that story, the Securities and Exchange Commission began issuing subpoenas to a number of shale gas companies. A few weeks after that, your own New York State Attorney General began issuing subpoenas, and just a few weeks after that, the Department of Energy slashed the estimates for the Marcellus shale reserves by 80%. It turned out that their prior estimates had been based largely upon information that had been provided to them by industry. Next slide, please. So you may well be wondering what exactly is going on here. Well, there's no doubt that gas exists in shale, that's a given. But shale gas has been touted as a cheap and abundant source of energy. Much emphasis has been focused purely on the amount of gas trapped in shales, but much of this gas may never be commercially extractable unless natural gas prices rise dramatically, in which case it's no longer a cheap source of energy. This is something which I think must be considered when addressing not only national energy policy, but also questions of how we allow our own regional areas, indeed our own neighborhoods, to be exploited for this resource. The questions facing this city, this region, are the same facing cities and regions all over the country where shale gas is found. It's important, I think, I do this every night, to sift through all the hype and rhetoric to assess whether production can truly be counted on to provide the benefits that industry has claimed. For instance, is production as secure as it appears? Will jobs and taxes really be as stable as claimed? What will the environmental impacts be? And can we count on energy independence from shale gas and unconventional oil? These are some of the questions I'd like to address tonight, and hopefully I will have some answers here for you. Next slide, please. I have never seen an investment more hyped than shale gas. Wall Street loves a sexy story, and shale gas provides just that with its incredible horizontal drilling techniques and Hollywood pyrotechnics of fracture stimulation. It was an easy sell. It started with the Barnett, which is where I live and where I'm from, moved on to the Fayetteville, the Haynesville, the Marcellus, the Bakken, the Eagle Ford. They're now drilling for shale gas in the UK, and talking about it in India and China. It's truly gone global. All the while, the hype has reached ever-giddy heights, with every shale play claimed to be better than the last. We've all heard the slogans, game changer, national treasure, shale gas revolution, 100 years of gas available, and energy independence for all. But being ever the contrarian, I began to question shale gas back in 2009. After years in the financial markets in Europe and the US, the one thing that I've learned is that if anything is hyped to this extent, you best beware. Once I began digging, I found that jobs had been overstated, taxes and revenues overstated, reserves overstated, and economic stability overstated. So let's look at some of the claims that have been made, or as I like to call it, take a look at some of the rhetoric versus the reality. This is a quote from Jim Mulva, the CEO of ConocoPhillips. He says, if oil is the prize, then natural gas is the gift, nature's gift to the people of the world. However, Platts Oil and Gas Reporter, which is one of our preeminent industry publications in this country, had this to say about shale gas. The switch from shale gas to shale oil suggests that shale gas can survive only through cross-subsidization, not on its own merit. Perpetual expansion cannot forever disguise a serious problem with the bottom line. Next slide. Mr. Mulva went on to say that gas can enhance energy supply security through its abundance. There's enough to meet the residential, industrial, commercial, and power generation needs. However, Bernstein Research, which is which is a Manhattan financial research firm, and they specialize in oil and gas. They had this to say about the Barnett. Recent frac data from the Barnett shows a play in severe decline. Now keep in mind that the Barnett was touted as an economic powerhouse for at least 40 to 50 years. It lasted about 6, as it turned out. Recent frac data from the Barnett shows a play in severe decline. The Barnett's well failure rate also continues to rise over time. And as I stated earlier, the U.S. Geological Survey recently went in and slashed the Department of Energy's estimates by 80% in the Marcellus play. Next slide, please. So let's examine Mr. Mulva's assertion that gas can enhance energy supply security through its abundance. There appears to be a great deal of confusion regarding production versus reserves. A leading argument states that shale gas has risen from 2% of all natural gas production in 2000 to 23% a mere 10 years later, a statistic the MIT group calls a paradigm shift. But this is misleading unless put into context. Drilling for conventional gas, and I always have to stop here and ask, shall I define the difference between conventional and unconventional gas for you? No, you know the difference. Everybody knows the difference. You want me to, I'll very quickly define it. Okay. Conventional gas is the way we've drilled for gas forever. You drop a vertical well bore down, and you've hopefully done your geology, and you hit a pocket or a sea of oil or gas, and you extract the mineral. Unconventional oil and gas is when you drop the vertical well bore into the formation, and then you go out horizontally. Okay? And this technology, by the way, is absolutely astonishing. I mean, they can do conceivably virtual corkscrews with the horizontal drilling. I mean, it's truly amazing. So, drilling for conventional gas, i.e. vertical drilling, in this country began to wane in the late 70s. When shale gas burst on the scene, unconventional drilling, Wall Street was only too happy to invest in the sexy new story, and consequently investment in conventional gas projects has been absolutely decimated. Absolutely decimated. The money's completely dried up. There's no money to explore for conventional gas. And you may be wondering, well, so what? Well, shale gas has grown as a percentage of all natural gas. That's true. But it's been at the expense of conventional gas projects. It is not adding to existing and growing supplies of conventional gas, but it is replacing them. The Energy Information Administration estimates that natural gas will grow by only 0.8%. It's not enormous. 0.8% per annum through 2030, because conventional projects will be depleting and they will not be being replaced. So is this a boom? It's certainly been characterized as a boom, but it makes sense to look at some of the underlying reasons for the precipitous rise in production. It's a fact that while gas prices were plummeting, many shale companies continue to drill, and they continue to drill still, even though prices have hit 10-year lows in the last few days. They continue to drill rather than shut in wells. Shutting in wells has always been the conventional approach, the traditional approach, for this industry when prices went low. You shut in the wells and you waited for prices to go higher again, and that has not happened in this case. Why? Because shale wells were depleting so quickly that new wells have to be drilled continuously in order to maintain cash flow. The problem is that given the heavy debt burdens of many of these shale companies, which is also most unusual for the oil and gas industry, typically oil and gas companies sit on mountains of cash. They did not sit on mountains of debt, but these companies sit on mountains of debt and have no cash. So Given the heavy debt burdens of some of these shale gas operators, drilling was a way to meet debt service and to keep from declaring bankruptcy. Now, financial analysts and journalists have begun referring to this as a drilling treadmill. Excuse me. Next slide, please. An excellent example of this drilling treadmill can be seen by examining the audited accounts of the city of Fort Worth in the Barnett Shale, which is where I'm from, where I live. I'm going to talk a lot about the Barnett Shale here tonight, primarily because, as he told you earlier, the Barnett is the oldest shale play. We have the most historical production history. We have the most financial data on the Barnett. And all shale plays essentially work the same. And so you can use the Barnett essentially as a cautionary tale of what's heading your direction, what you can expect from the Marcellus as it's exploited. And so let's take a look at the audited accounts of the city of Fort Worth. In 2008, the city received approximately $50 million in gas revenues. This dropped precipitously in 2009 to about $19 million, and in 2010 began to trend back up and closed the year at about $38 million. Now, on the surface of things, it would seem that we were recovering from the economic downturn and things were returning to normal. That's certainly the spin that industry put on it. However, you cannot look at these numbers without also considering the number of producing wells that were brought online during that time frame. You can't get a good picture otherwise. So that's exactly what I did. Between 2008 and 2010, the number of producing wells within the city grew more than fourfold. So even though there were now 4 times more wells producing within the city, these new wells could only keep revenues at 2/3 of prior levels when there were 4 times less wells. Why? Because the older wells deplete so quickly and so dramatically that new wells cannot keep a balance in the production. We're seeing this pattern occur repeatedly across North Texas. Denton County saw a 58% increase in the number of wells for a 23% decrease in revenues. The wells at DFW Airport have come in with dismal returns. They never came anywhere near the original projections of Chesapeake and have now plummeted so precipitously that at year-end 2011, geologists expected them to produce less than 1/10 of their original projections. I've not seen the figures at year-end, but I was told this in mid-December, that they were expecting them to be 1/10 of the original projections. The University of Texas at Arlington saw revenues peak at $7 million with a mere 6 wells on campus, only to see them plummet drastically. Revenues in 2010 were down to $800,000 per annum, even though there are now 22 producing wells on campus. So again, as you see, these wells may not provide economic stability for a very long period of time. It may be very short indeed. You get a nice economic boost right at the beginning, and then it drops off considerably, but you get a proliferation of wells. So taxes and revenues have also been overstated in the Marcellus, according to recent studies by Penn State and Ohio State. So let's take a look at those. These are 2 quotes. This is from the Penn State study. Only 18% of municipalities directly experiencing drilling activities said their tax revenues had increased, while 26% of the local governments indicated that their costs had increased. We've seen this all over North Texas. Costs do increase dramatically for municipalities. You have the costs of roads that get torn up because of all the additional truck traffic. There are many costs. Ongoing monitoring, trying to monitor some of the wells. The city of Fort Worth recently spent well over $1 million to do an environmental impact study, which I'm going to get to in just a few minutes. So there are all these ongoing costs of trying to, that municipalities end up incurring. They went on to say that these findings from local officials contrast with prior economic studies which predicted that there would be large local tax impacts, but which did not verify what has actually occurred. Next slide, please. Let's look at what we've received. Even while wells were proliferating and revenues plummeting, gas drilling has provided us with something else, and that's pollution and environmental degradation. As I stated, we're not big on environmental impact studies in Texas. We decide to do them after we've drilled 15,000 wells, and then we sit back and say, gee, maybe we ought to take a look at what's happening to our neighborhoods. And that's exactly what the city of Fort Worth did. There were over 2,000 wells within the city proper before they engaged in this environmental impact study. They hired ERG and released the findings reports last summer. What they found was the following. Benzene, a known human carcinogen, was detected at 94% of all the sites tested within the city proper. Other toxics of concern were found contributing to a toxic cocktail. we now have the dubious distinction of having the highest levels of formaldehyde that the scientists have ever seen anywhere on the planet outside of Brazil. We also have very high levels of carbon disulfide, a known neurotoxin. At my farm, they've done extensive testing at my farm. I opened it up for testing. And we've had carbon disulfide levels anywhere from 300 to 500 times what is normal for ambient urban air. And that's according to the Environmental Protection Agency. TCEQ, the Texas Commission on Environmental Quality, which is our equivalent of the DEC, recently confirmed that drilling activities are contributing more air toxics than all the cars, trucks, and airplanes combined in the region. In addition, in Tarrant County, which is where Fort Worth is, we have childhood asthma rates that are now twice the national average. And we also have another dubious distinction. DFW has now passed Houston, Texas, as the most polluted air in Texas. Now, for any of you who've been to Houston or been to the Houston Ship Channel, you know that that's really saying something. Okay, next slide, please. So, jobs and economic activity. Again, there was a study done in 2010 in the Marcellus, which was funded by industry, which claimed 44,000 jobs had been created and $7.1 billion in economic activity had come to the state of Pennsylvania. However, and this is a quote from the Times Tribune, but it's their quote, they're talking about the Penn State study. They said, a new study of the economic impacts of the Marcellus has found that natural gas development created roughly half the jobs and economic activity reported in earlier industry-funded studies. Next slide, please. The Ohio State study. Industry has projected 200,000 jobs for Ohio, but Ohio State thinks that it's going to end up being more like 20,000 jobs or 1/10 industry projections. You have to understand where industry is coming from. Obviously, they stand to gain a whole lot of money, and they're on a major public relations campaign when they release these studies. And so you have to take it with a grain of salt and use a bit of common sense. Ohio State actually went ahead and looked at Pennsylvania as well. Again, they were using Pennsylvania as a cautionary tale in the way that I'm using the Barnett for you tonight. And they said that although industry had originally projected 100,000 total jobs for Pennsylvania, they then revised their numbers down to 44,000, but Ohio State estimates that there have only been about 20,000 actual jobs gained in Pennsylvania. The other thing you have to remember about jobs is when industry comes in and says that there's going to be 20,000 jobs gained, that's fantastic. I would not argue that that's not a good thing. Jobs are a very good thing. However, it's misleading to just make that statement. You have to also take into consideration, this region is a classic example. This is a very beautiful region, and it's heavily reliant upon tourism. If you allowed shale gas extraction to come into this region, by its very nature, shale gas covers vast acreage of land. They pockmark the landscape. In Texas, we have pad sites approximately every half a mile. Every half a mile, it's about 2,500 feet. North, south, east, and west, and it covers an area that I believe is like 200 square miles. It's huge. It's enormous. And so you're going to have heavy industrial activities coming into an area that is reliant upon tourism. You're going to lose some jobs in the tourism industry. How much? I don't know. I can't say. But you can't just say that we're going to have a net job gain of 20,000 simply because gas drilling came to town. Came to a region. That's a misleading statement. You have to take into account what jobs are going to be lost because gas drilling came to town. It could end up that you end up with less jobs than you had even adding in the 20,000 from industry. You don't know. So, let's see, next slide, please. This isn't the first time jobs have been overstated by industry, obviously. Down in the Barnett, the Chamber of Commerce had the Perryman Group, hired the Perryman Group to do a study. This was in 2008, and they sat there I was sitting there in the audience, and they claimed 111,000 direct industry jobs from shale production in North Texas alone. And I sat there and I thought, I'm sorry, I don't believe that. So I did a little bit of checking, and I found out that according to the Bureau of Labor Statistics, there were only 166,000 jobs total onshore and offshore for the entire U.S. oil and gas industry in 2008. And yet we were to believe that 111,000 of those jobs were in North Texas alone. Chesapeake Energy, a mere year later, claimed that there were now 53,200 jobs. Please note that there was a 50% drop in jobs, by the way, in 1 year. They claimed 53,200 jobs, direct jobs, in shale production. And I did some checking again and found out that there were only 93,800 jobs total for the U.S. onshore and offshore. I'll let you do your own determining as far as what you think of industry's map when it comes to jobs. Next slide, please. Record capacity. Industry likes to tell us that we're sitting at record capacity, and we are, thanks to thousands and thousands of new shale gas wells that have come online and been drilled in the last few years. However, these wells, many of these wells, they've kept them producing, as I stated before, in order that some of the operators would not have to declare bankruptcy and or to meet debt service. This is, in my opinion, a mismanagement of natural resources. If you are a mineral owner, and I'm assuming many of you sitting in this room are here tonight, think about it for a moment. Do you want your minerals harvested at rock bottom prices, or do you want them harvested at a reasonable price? Once your minerals are harvested, they're gone forever. So these companies are harvesting your minerals and paying you rock bottom prices, and have been for the last couple of years now, because prices have not bounced back at all since the economic downturn. In fact, they've gotten worse in the last few months. Do you want your minerals harvested during this time? It doesn't make sense for you as a mineral owner. And they're being harvested simply so that these companies, because some companies have been so poorly managed financially that they don't have any choice but to keep production rolling. As I said, analysts are calling this the drilling treadmill. So, while there's no doubt that we're sitting at record capacity, it may be for the wrong reasons. Further, if this capacity is the product of the drilling treadmill, whereas we've seen more wells cannot keep up production because older wells are declining so quickly, then I think it can very reasonably be argued that there's very little depth or security behind this record capacity. Once you let up on the drilling, supplies tumble very quickly indeed. Record capacity, however, instills in all of us a notion that shale gas is both extremely cheap and enormously abundant, when in fact this may be a false sense of security. Next slide, please. One statistic that's bandied about is that the U.S. has a 100-year supply of natural gas, thanks in large part from the shale plays. Now we learned that government estimates have been slashed dramatically, and further that EIA's original erroneous assumptions were based in large part on data provided by industry. I think it's also interesting that this 100-year supply of gas was dependent upon the earlier estimates, including the Marcellus. And keep in mind that the Marcellus estimates have now been slashed by 80% by the Department of Energy. So where this 100-year supply of gas is going to come from when you've taken your biggest shale play, you've slashed the reserve estimates by 80% is, I think, a very valid question. Something also which is very important to consider is that these estimates do not take into account the cost of extracting the gas. They're just simply looking at what is down there underneath the ground. And some of these pockets are so small that they're just not viable enough to get enough gas out in order to justify the cost, the high cost of these horizontal wells. And that's where I'd like to go next, to the financial anomalies that have cropped up in regard to cost and SEC reporting and even shareholder value destruction. Next slide, please. Okay, the numbers I'm about to throw out at you over the next few slides, I want to make this very clear. These are not projections, they're not estimates, these are numbers that have been filed by the operators with various state agencies, so there's very little wiggle room in these numbers. It is what it is. It's historical production. The numbers I'm going to get into with the SEC, with regard to the SEC and shareholder filings, again, those are taken from company 10-Ks filed with the Securities and Exchange Commission. Very little wiggle room. I mean, I would invite anybody from industry who happens to be sitting here tonight to take me on some of these numbers, because they were filed by these companies with state and federal agencies. So, according to production history filed by operators in various states, shale gas volumes have not turned out to be as homogeneous as once thought. In the earlier days of the plays, they referred to shale gas as a manufacturing model. They literally stated that you could drop the drill bit in anywhere and you would hit gas. And so it was just like a factory model out in the countryside, in the landscape. Aubrey McClendon, however, finally admitted that there was a time when you were all told that any of the 17 counties in the Barnett Shale would be as good as any other county. we found out that there are about 2.5 counties where you really want to be. Next slide, please. By the way, those 2.5 counties are referred to by the industry as core areas, sometimes tier areas, but usually they call them core areas. Yet even within these core areas, production can be quite erratic indeed. Geologists down in Houston have examined 9,100 of the 15,000 wells. They've actually done more since I made this slide, but we're going to stick with these numbers tonight. 9,100 of the 15,000 wells in the Barnett. This is from Railroad Commission data filed by the operators, and they have found that less than 6% of all the wells have met minimum economic thresholds. The Barnett has been not very economically viable. They're also finding this now in the Fayetteville and Haynesville, where we're getting more production histories coming online. We're seeing the same picture emerge in these two shale plays as well. Dr. John Lee, again, I'm going to have to revise my slides when I get home. He just recently moved to the University of Houston from Texas A&M. He's a petroleum reservoir analyst, and he was the architect of the SEC rule change, which I'm going to get to in just a moment. Dr. Lee had this to say to me in an email. We did an email exchange a little over a year ago. And he said, it is sometimes said that 20% of shale wells carry a project, the other 80% can easily be uneconomic. Now keep in mind, you're talking about allowing heavy industrial activity to cover a very large tract of land, and you're counting on only 20% of those wells being economically viable. Therefore, 80% of that land that they come in and use are going to be, typically, wells, according to Industry Insider, that are not going to be economically viable. So keep that in mind. Next slide, please. This was from a Bloomberg piece that came out last week. It's just reiterating what Aubrey McClendon said, but I thought because it's so recent that it would be good to include these quotes. The quirky nature of shale geology means the risks are high that an investment made in a sparsely drilled prospect will go bust. One parcel of land may hold enough fuel to justify prices, while the adjacent land is almost worthless to drillers. That is precisely what Aubrey McClendon was referring to when he said there was a time when we told you we could drop a drill bit in anywhere, now we know we can't. Next slide is going to be the visual. I think this is an outstanding visual. I borrowed this from Labyrinth Consulting. This is in the Barnett. As I stated, pad sites every half a mile, roughly every 2,500 feet, north, south, east, and west. Every place you see blue is literally a carpet of wells. Every place you see blue is a carpet of wells. Every place you see red dots is a well that made money. I think that's a very damning slide. Next slide, please. Excuse me. So let's get into the SEC rule change now, because this is where the claims of the Ponzi schemes and the Enron moments that insiders refer to in the emails that the New York Times did such a brilliant job of bringing together. By the way, if you haven't looked at the document reader for that story, it's unbelievable. There are hundreds of emails taken from geologists at these companies, from upper management and so forth, stating unequivocally these wells were cracked. And we know it, but, you know, that's the way it goes. So, the SEC rule change for oil and gas, the new SEC rule change, was adopted in 2009, and companies can now claim reserves that were previously not allowed and book them without a mandatory third-party audit. Now, I don't have a problem with expanding that definition of reserves. I think there was a very valid argument by industry that they needed more leeway to claim reserves further out from a proved well. I don't have a problem with that. The problem that I have is that the SEC went on to allow them to claim these reserves without making it mandatory that they receive an independent third-party audit. Therefore, we simply have to take their word for it that the reserves exist. We have no way of checking otherwise. I find this problematic, obviously, because this could open the door to optimistic assumption making. There's clearly an upside to being able to book more reserves. It's the ability to make a company appear more attractive than it may really be. It's the ability to make it appear that your company is growing when it may indeed not be growing. And it most decidedly can make it appear that your finding costs are plummeting when in fact they may not be. Next slide, please. Mark Papa, CEO of EOG Resources, told financial analysts that those that select to book liberally, this was right after the rule change went into effect, can have extremely low finding costs and those that book more conservatively could have higher finding costs. EOG went on to increase reserve estimates by more than 135% under the new SEC rules. By the way, I told them last night, you're going to have to invite me back up here because I'm working on a new presentation and I'm pulling comments that the SEC has been sending to these shale gas companies for the last roughly year and a half. And there's some very interesting comments indeed. One of my favorite ones, just kind of off the top of my head, is where the SEC claims that some of these reserve estimates are mathematically impossible. And some of the comments get even better still about the longevity of well lives and so forth, but you'll have to invite me back. EOG went on to increase reserve estimates by 135% under the new rules. Other shale companies did the same. Some increased reserves by as much as 200%. Now, for those of you who may not be following me very, very well, to just use a very simple example, if you have your reserves, what these companies do is they divide their costs into their reserves, and that gives them their mathematical numbers. If you can increase your reserve number that you divide your costs into, you see where I'm going here? Obviously, if you have a much bigger number over here and you divide your costs into it, it's going to make it look like your costs have plummeted. And that's exactly what they started announcing as soon as the SEC rule change went through. So, obviously, massive reserve revisions like this, as I stated, can make a company appear to be much more attractive than it really may be. And it enables these companies to leverage up and borrow more monies. But again, we go back, this is kind of like the mortgage-backed securities bubble. You're talking about they're borrowing monies on reserves that may or may not exist, frankly, because we don't know. They haven't been independently verified. So, while overall costs did drop throughout 2009, the dramatic drop in costs seen at some of these shale gas companies cannot be completely explained away by this factor. Next slide, please. Yeah, right there. Ernst & Young stated, they did a study and they stated that for the oil and gas industry as a whole, finding and development costs decreased an average of 48% in 2009. These declines were driven by the previously discussed decreases in all categories of spending, along with strong reserve additions, they said. So Ernst & Young did recognize that there was some activity going on with strong reserve additions. But at 5 of the 7 shale gas companies that I studied, costs dropped considerably more than the overall market decline. These were the same companies that had chosen to increase their reserve estimates substantially, some by as much as 200%. Next slide, please. Let's take a look at some of these. Petrohawk. Their finding and development costs in 2008 were $51.50. They revised their reserve estimates up 200%, and literally overnight, their cost plunged to a mere $7.03, an overall decline of 86%. Comstock Resources and PetroQuest also had similar declines in excess of 75%. Range Resources and Chesapeake Energy tied at 66% declines, well in excess of the average 48% seen amongst all oil and gas producers. And EOG was the only company I studied whose costs were in line with the industry average, right at 48%. These plummeting cost figures, again, I keep harping on this, but it is so important to grasp, are based on reserve estimates that haven't been independently verified. Yeah. So, do they exist? We don't really know. In addition, many of the companies pull out sunk costs, what they call sunk costs, which are things like the cost of leases. They pull those out of cost figures, and by breaking these out, it can appear that costs are lower still, but leases have to be paid for. They're part of the overall financial transaction, and they must be factored back in at some point. And when these are factored back in, costs can rise significantly. Next slide. Okay, going back to Dr. Lee, I know this is kind of a long quote here, and I apologize for that, but it's a very important quote. Dr. Lee, the architect of the SEC rule change, stated that with proper averaging and a large enough sample of wells, we believe we can predict the average outcome of a drilling program without the ability to predict the average outcome of any individual well. If we don't have enough wells for valid statistics for what we've already drilled, or if we don't have enough future drilling prospects, or opportunities, to have reasonable expectations of average outcomes, then we may have to write down our assets as some are doing. Okay, keep in mind that the Barnett is touted as an economic powerhouse for the next 40 to 50 years. As I stated before, it ended up lasting about 6 to 7. So let's look at what some of these shale gas companies began doing, and they began writing down assets from the Barnett first. Why? Because numbers could be verified, and it was becoming quite embarrassing, quite frankly. So, next slide. This is taken from company 10Ks. Shale gas companies did indeed begin writing down assets. Impairment charges as a percentage of total shareholder equity has been enormous at some of these companies. PetroHawk charged off assets as impairments that accounted for 185% of total shareholder equity. Quicksilver charged off 151% of total shareholder equity. Chesapeake 115%. Devon 102%. Range also took a hefty impairment charge when they sold off all of their Barnett Shale assets in 2011, and they took an impairment charge of about $500 million, it's an asset write-down. And I haven't done the numbers yet, but just doing them in my head, I think that accounts for about 40 to 45% of total shareholder equity of the company. So as you can see, these charges, they're writing down assets that are higher than the company is actually worth in the shareholder equity. Obviously, that can be problematic when considering shareholder value destruction. Okay, so let's begin to put the pieces of the puzzle together here. As we've seen, production is at the expense of conventional projects, so it isn't really as great as it seems. Reserves do not have to be independently verified. Jobs have been overstated. Revenues and taxes have been overstated. Well, decline curves are very steep, so security of supply is questionable at best. Reserve estimates have jumped considerably on company books, but again, they haven't been independently verified. And estimates by government have been slashed significantly, and industry insiders consider 80% of shale wells to be easily uneconomic. To my mind, this is a very alarming picture. Okay, so then we get to the question which always arises, and I'm going to tell you up front, I'm going to preempt you because someone will ask this question. If shale gas is such a dud, then why are the majors falling all over themselves to invest in it? Over the past few weeks, you may be aware that record prices have been paid by foreign entities for U.S. assets. $8 billion in deals has been consummated in the first 2 weeks of 2012. Why? Well, let's take a look at that. We're going to get into that and see how this is going to affect all of us. Next slide, please. Next slide. Sorry, I should have. Okay. The first thing you have to remember about majors is, or really any publicly traded company, is that these companies operate under two sets of economics. And I call them the field economics and the street economics. Field economics are essentially what's happening out in the field. What are the wells doing? What sort of production am I getting? What are my costs, etc. What's happening out in the field. Street economics are a very different animal indeed. Street economics are what do I have to do? What do I need my balance sheet to look like to entice and keep financial analysts and investors interested in my company so that my share price keeps going up and I'm on a growth trajectory. Those two are two very different sets of economics. You cannot have a publicly traded company without considering both sets of economics, and they do not often jive with one another. So you have to keep that in mind. Also, I'm going to ask you to keep in mind that international crude pricing hit record levels in 2011. I'm going to get to why that's important in just a moment, but please keep that in mind. We hit international record prices for crude in 2011. The last thing that you have to understand about the majors is that the majors have not been able to grow reserves in over a decade. That is without exception across the board. Some of them have even dropped in reserves. Now, why does this matter? Well, reserves for an oil and gas company show a financial analyst what sort of growth prospects this company has going forward in the future. So if you aren't able to grow your reserves, you aren't really able to grow your company. And if that's the case, then financial analysts are going to look at that and they're going to penalize you in some way for not having future beneficial growth prospects. So the majors found themselves in that position. Now, I think it's very fascinating that the majors dabbled in shale gas in the early days. In fact, ExxonMobil came out and had a press conference just a couple of months ago, and the CFO stated unequivocally, he said, we couldn't make shale gas work for us economically in the beginning. And I thought, of course you couldn't. But when did ExxonMobil go in and buy XTO Energy? just 3 months after the SEC rule change went into effect. Why? Because suddenly they could buy companies with existing reserves that had doubled, or more than doubled their reserves in some cases overnight, and the reserves didn't have to be independently verified. That is playing into what I refer to as street economics. Okay, so, excuse me. Something very interesting has been going on for quite some time. We've heard industry loudly and very, very publicly extolling things like the Pickens Plan, which is essentially a roadmap for us to become more dependent upon natural gas, use more natural gas to run our truck fleets, which deliver goods all around the country. Also, they would like for us to convert more of our electric power plants to run on gas. And the argument states that shale gas has made natural gas cheap and abundant, and therefore it makes perfect sense. There have certainly been benefits to the lower natural gas price, but this populist argument is very effective, and it plays well in the current political environment, because the industry and politicians can promise us that we'll be energy independent thanks to shale gas, we'll bring jobs home, and we can bypass all the unpleasantness of foreign or international terrorism. Okay? But behind the scenes, very, very quietly indeed, as I stated, I came across an obscure document a little over a year ago, and that was the first indication that I had of what was coming down the road towards us, and you're only now, in about the last 2 to 3 months, seeing anybody really in the mainstream media even beginning to write about that, and that is shale gas exportation. And you may wonder, well, so what? Well, it's going to have big implications, and I'm going to go over that now. Amid all this fanfare and media blitz extolling how we need to convert power plants and bring jobs home and run our truck fleets on natural gas, the industry was actually approaching the Department of Energy and asking and submitting permits and asking that existing import terminals for LNG, which is liquefied natural gas, which already exist in this country. And by the way, you can't ship natural gas until you turn it into a liquid form. Okay, so you have to have an LNG terminal if you're importing or exporting natural gas. They went to the Department of Energy. They have submitted permits, very quietly indeed, and they have now submitted 8 permits. And the first one, next slide please, the first one actually was approved in October, just a couple of months ago, so we know for a fact that shale gas will be exported now. And there are 7 more permits pending as we speak. There will be more that will go into the DOE. But of the 8 initial permits that they've got right now at the Department of Energy, the industry has already committed 20% of our shale gas to be exported overseas. Interestingly enough, earlier in this week I made these presentations, and it was in a sense Deborah Rogers stating that if shale gas is exported, natural gas prices will rise. Yesterday, the Energy Information Administration released a report and said, if shale gas is exported, gas prices will rise. So it's not just me anymore stating this. It was very relieved to see that. That's all the truth. So you may be wondering, well, who cares? Next slide. How will that affect me, and why do I care about this? All right, I pulled these 2 quotes to start out so that you begin to get a little bit of a background of what's happening here. This is from the Oil and Gas Financial Journal. It said the Chinese are willing to pay a premium to secure North American resources necessary to feed the growing Asian economy. EIA came out, I think it was last week, and estimated that China's demand for natural gas will grow at 20% per annum through, I believe it was 2030. That is enormous. It is enormous for an economy that size to have a growth in demand of 20% per annum for the next 20 years. This quote from Shell is one of my favorites, from Royal Dutch Shell, and it just doesn't get any more straightforward than this. Shell has placed a big emphasis on North American gas. It's an area of growth for us. We've invested something like $15 billion since 2004 in the onshore sector. What we develop here, we'd like to export to the rest of the world. Okay, they're telling you what they're going to do, no doubt about it. Next slide, please. Okay, so how does this work? Well, something interesting is happening, because the price of natural gas is tied, it's indexed to the price of crude. Remember, I asked you to remember that crude prices hit record levels in 2011. That is why you're seeing foreign majors so keen to purchase U.S. assets. Excuse me. While gas trades currently under $3 here in this country, and we hit about $2.48, actually we hit $2.39 the other day. That may have been an intraday high. I don't know what it closed at because I've been kind of busy. But anyway, it's under $3. It is trading currently, as we speak, in China or Asia, but let's just say, talk about China here, anywhere between $12 and $15. Okay, that is an enormous difference. That's what they're paying right now, today, $12 to $15. If crude continues on its trajectory upwards that it followed in 2011, which, given the problems in the Strait of Hormuz and so forth, there's no reason to think that it won't, then their gas prices could continue to move higher over the next 6, 8, 12 months. So, if you're an operator, who do you want to sell your product to? Somebody who's going to pay you $2.50 or somebody who's going to pay you $15? I don't think anybody in this room needs to think about that one very long. It's a substantial spread for these operators. They can extract, pipe, ship the gas to Asia, deliver it to Asia for around $9 and get paid $15. That is an enormous spread. Now you see why the majors want to get their hands on shale gas assets. Next slide, please. Now, if you look at natural gas prices and the benefits that they provide if they're low to the U.S. economy, I actually got this figure from industry, and I think it's a valid figure. I think it's a very valid figure. They claim that natural gas prices have given the U.S. economy an economic stimulus of $250 million per day over the last couple of years. And by the way, that figure is based on gas being roughly around $4. It's now at $2.50, so we're getting an even bigger stimulus right now. U.S. manufacturers, particularly plastics, have announced that they're going to be ramping up production, particularly here in the Northeast, bringing jobs back home. A lot of political talk and posturing about that, we're bringing jobs back home. And why? Because they claim that shale gas is cheap and abundant. But if natural gas is exported, then prices will rise perhaps precipitously. EIA, as I stated before, in the report that came out yesterday, they are projecting that gas prices will rise 54%. 54% if shale gas is exported, and they're only counting the 8 contracts they have right now on their desk. There will be more contracts that will be submitted. So, gas prices are going to rise significantly. And that, to my mind, affects a classic consumer squeeze. Why? Because if you have, well, let me just do it this way. If we become more dependent upon natural gas, if we convert our power plants, if we convert our truck fleets to power plants, to natural gas, then we essentially become more dependent upon natural gas, and we put ourselves in the exact same boat that we're already in with crude. We became much too dependent upon crude, and now we are, we have to live with the vicissitudes of the market. We're going to do that again, apparently, with natural gas. And the industry is working very hard to ensure that that happens. Why? Because they're going to make money. It's a good business decision for them. But is it a good thing for the American consumer? Of course not, because if you convert your electricity be more dependent, I'm very tired, I've given like 10 presentations in 6 days, to be more dependent upon natural gas. If you've ramped up your manufacturing production to be more dependent upon natural gas as a feedstock, if your truck fleets are now running on more natural gas to move inventory around the country, and then natural gas prices are now moving through the roof, what's going to happen? I'm going to let Aubrey McClendon, CEO of Chesapeake Energy, tell you what's going to happen. He actually inadvertently stated the consequences of high natural gas prices a few months ago at the Marcellus Shale Convention. He was referencing what would happen if operators were not given a complete free rein to drill any place they wanted, anytime in the U.S. I personally found his logic a bit flawed. I often find his logic flawed, but anyway, I did find it a bit flawed in this case because even without free rein, we're already sitting at record capacity and historically low prices. So if we gave them free rein, the price would go lower still. I can't quite see why a CEO of a gas company would want gas to go to zero. But anyway, oddly enough, I found he gives a very concise and reasonable exposition, however, on what would happen if natural gas prices went through the roof. His words, not mine. He says, 70% of American homes on natural gas will be cold. Natural gas heat will be cold. 35% of American homes and businesses and factories that use electricity from natural gas will go dark. Crops that require natural gas fertilizer will not be grown. He himself referred to this as a stark future. I could not agree more, but he and his colleagues will be very, very rich indeed. Thank you.
I know there's going to be a bunch of questions. What would I like to do now? There's I know an announcement that somebody wants to make. I know there's also a basket that's going to be passed around. The admission was free, but the costs of putting on this presentation obviously are not. So I encourage you to give generously with the basket that comes around. The announcement, Dave?
Sure. Go ahead. Okay. Yeah, thank you, Deborah, for such an eloquent awakening to reality. As you may have known, there was a phenomenal forum at Corning Community College this year, Tuesday, January 24th. No, that's coming up. I'm sorry. She's not the only one that's tired. But anyway, there's going to be a follow-up energy forum coming up. And this is a follow-up to the one that was up at the college. And this is going to be about energy efficiency, conservation, and renewables. So Tuesday, January 24th, 7 p.m., Corning Public Library. We're going to be doing this. This is a follow-up to it was November 12th. Please come, and you can see me or somebody else in the room. There's a lot of people that know about it, and just mark your calendars for that. This is a good way to start thinking about real ways to create energy independence. Pardon? The date again is January 24th at 7 p.m. at the Corning Public Library. And I think it's free, isn't it, Ruth? It's free. How can you go wrong? And maybe somebody will bring cookies. I don't know. So it's going to be on the ground floor, and the whole theme of this is going to be skipping the bridge fuels, because we don't need them. Thank you.
Okay. Just to have ask Helen to come up. Helen Swatche is our next speaker. She's an attorney with the Community Environmental Defense Council in Ithaca, New York. The CEDEC is a not-for-profit public interest law firm that provides free, high-quality legal advocacy and assistance to communities and citizen groups whose land, air, water, health, and quality of life are threatened by industrialization. And since the CEDC does not charge its clients, they rely entirely on donations and grants from individuals and foundations dedicated to protecting communities. Helen and her husband David have been working tirelessly throughout the state to help communities protect their rural character by passing bans and moratoria on gas drilling. And as I indicated in my opening comments, and as Deborah so elegantly put forth, the more you learn about this stuff, the more questions that are raised. So we're certainly encouraging towns and villages to at least delay the drilling until more studies can be done, more information can be obtained. So please welcome Helen.
Hi, so my name is Helen Slotche, and I'd like to also thank Deborah for such a clear explanation of what is often so fuddling, trying to figure out, and most importantly, the questions she answered is the field economics don't really make any sense. What's going on and why? What's driving this? And it's clearly not what's in our the way that shale gas production and the like is working out is not being and it's not an answer to the question of what is best for our communities, what's best for my town, what's best for me. It's what's best for this international economy that is not always particularly rational when you get right down to it. And as I sat and listened to Deborah, there's always things that we're concerned about, trying to keep our eye on this constantly moving target. But what became particularly clear to me listening to this tonight is the prospect of being a resource colony, not just any particular state or community in this town, but our entire country being a resource colony for Asia and China, and cementing our position as subordinate to that economy, that our own ability to produce food, to warm our homes, to have any sort of economic security and independence is completely shot if foreign companies own our shale gas and are exporting it out of our country. So that is as scary as any particular sort of doom and gloom prospect of the future that I've seen. So thank you for once again depressing me. But the tie-in for us to Deborah's talk tonight is in answer to the question, what can I do? And for so long in New York, I at least did. Like very many of you would come to these presentations and be like, all right, I get it, it's not a great idea, what do you want me to do about it? And we've found that the most receptive place and a very great place for people to turn their energies, trying to fix SEC rules and the workings of Wall Street economics and international economies, that's really not within our grasp. At least I don't consider it to be within mine. But what we can do is go to local town board meetings, talk with our neighbors, and in the state of New York, put a pause on this in a particular town. And by enacting moratoriums and more land use bans on this sort of activities. As we've seen, and it has been described, it's very intensive, very costly for the community, with very little reward. And through our zoning powers, we can make land use decisions as a community and say, certain land uses just aren't allowed in our town, they're not appropriate for our town, they don't fit with the vision of our town. And so we've heard, again here tonight, a whole additional litany of reasons why a town might say, this really isn't the future I want to buy into. So that's what we at CECD do, to the extent that any of you are working, or trying to figure out what to do in your towns. Dave and I are here, we're happy to talk to people afterwards about how people can organize in a town, what town boards can do, and so thank you very much.
Yeah, just to add, it's very empowering when you go to these town and village board meetings and see towns and villages standing up and saying that we believe that we know what's best for our community and not bureaucrats or politicians in Albany. So what I'd like to do is open it up to questions. I'll go around with the microphone, maybe have Deborah come up. And I haven't had any either. Oh wait, what was red?
That's okay.
Okay, some questions, yes.
Yes. One thing I'd really like to know, I was startled the other day to read the statistic that our #1 export last year in the United States to other countries was gasoline, simultaneously getting the doom and gloom that by the middle of the summer we're probably going to be paying $4.50 or $5 again for gasoline. And I get so angry that politicians continue to make what I think is the specious argument about, protecting America's interests, making sure that we're having these energy jobs here at home, keeping ourselves non-reliant on foreign oil sources. And yet I'm thinking, we're going to do the same thing with gas, as you just pointed out, but apparently we've already done with gasoline. And yet, how can politicians not get that if we've already announced last year that was our #1 export,
I
gasoline?
think they do get it. I think that they also get very large campaign contributions.
What do you think then of the follow-up to try and reverse the Supreme Court decision to give citizenship for constitutional rights to corporations to make it a constitutional amendment to revoke that? I think that's a likely possibility.
Well, I don't, that's actually a little bit out of my area of expertise. That's really probably more of a legal question, and I'm not a lawyer. And I'm married to one, so he would be very glad that I just said that. And, I mean, I don't mean to not answer your question. I can certainly give you my personal opinion, but that's all it would be, is my personal opinion. And I personally think that we now live, I told someone this earlier time, I personally think that we now live in a corporate oligarchy.
Sure. Thanks for coming. Sure appreciate it. And wanted to ask you, what about the water? I've only been to your lovely state once, and you all that fracking must take a lot of water that you might not have the assets we have. And I just thought I might mention, you probably already know that there's an exclusion for the city of Syracuse watershed and downstate. Occasionally there's a rift between us up here and those in New York City that are excluded from having fracking take place in proximity downstate. So can you speak just a little bit about the economics of water, where you get it, where it's used for, who doesn't get it when it's used for fracking in your state? Thank you.
You know, water is an interesting point, and I really didn't cover it at all tonight. I get angry when I hear industry use the argument, you guys, we don't use any more than a golf course, because that is so misleading to say that. It's very, very different. There are two different animals indeed, and you can certainly argue the merits. I made a joke about this last night, but I'm going to make it again tonight because it's the truth. You can argue the merits of watering a golf course. I certainly can. I cannot stand the game of golf. I'm awful at it. I actually think somebody in the golf ball one time, yeah, by accident, and they now say that you have to wear a hockey mask if you play golf and go to golf. So I'm not very good at it. And but if you water a golf course, that water percolates down and it recharges aquifers. That is not the case with water that's used in hydraulic fracturing. It is permanently removed from the hydrological cycle, so you cannot compare those two things. I don't think you can fairly compare those two things. My favorite water story is we are in the worst drought in Texas's history, and that's saying something. We've had some pretty amazing droughts, and we are in the worst drought in our history. We went on water rationing in the Dallas-Fort Worth region, September 1st. Okay, a couple of weeks before Christmas. Well, I have to back up here. I'm sorry, I always have to do this. In between Dallas and Fort Worth is a city called Arlington, Texas. And Arlington, Texas has, in my opinion, done more. You could not find a city on this planet that has been more accommodating to the shale gas industry than Arlington, Texas. Let's put it that way. Okay, so I guess this is why Chesapeake picked Arlington, no kidding, to do this. We have been on water rationing for 3 months. And somebody called into the city of Arlington from a residential neighborhood in Arlington and said, you know what, there are all these Chesapeake water trucks parked out here in our neighborhood and they're hooked up to the fire hydrant. They were stealing water from the city of Arlington. And the funny part was, I got this call from the news director at one of the, I'm kind of famous now, so I get all these fun calls from people. And they said, we had to call you because we knew you would love this story. So they were stealing water from the city of Arlington. But what was really funny is that they weren't even using it to frack in Arlington well. They were driving it to Grand Prairie, which is about, I don't know, 8 or 10 miles away, and using it to frack wells in Grand Prairie because Grand Prairie had cut them off on water. And I guess they thought, Arlington won't care. They've been over backwards to help us. So, water is an issue. I also live fairly close to the guy, I don't know if you guys have seen the video, the man who could light his water hose on fire, Range Resources case. I live fairly close to him, and one of my best girlfriends lives 2 houses down. So it's all very exciting in Texas right now.
You really are famous. Yeah, I heard another story from Dr. Sandra Steingraber, who I heard speak a few months back, told some pretty chilling stories about people in Texas with signs in front of their houses and need water, while tanker after tanker went by with millions of gallons of water. Yes, sir?
I'd like to ask
Closer.
about the pipeline that they're talking that they would like to put in from Canada
Keystone XL.
to Texas.
Yeah.
Now, why does Texas want it from Canada when they got all these wells, all this gas?
It's actually a crude pipeline.
Huh?
It's actually a crude pipeline, is my understanding. It comes from, isn't it tar sands crude? Yeah. And I thought it was gonna stop in Texas, yeah. So, to be perfectly honest, I have not done a lot of research on that. I've just kind of read probably what you've read in the papers.
They also put one from Canada to New York City just 2-3 years ago, right through this area, from underneath the swamps on the Watkins Road. Where does that lead to?
Well, I'm not sure because I'm not familiar with that pipeline. It could be leading to an export terminal for all I know. I don't know. I'm sorry, I can't answer. I'm not familiar with that pipeline.
Maybe others can know this, but the Millennium Pipeline is from southeast central New York, right through East County, to the southern tier, across the southern tier to New York City.
Right.
I'm assuming that even way back when they had that pipeline, they had exporters of natural gas, somewhere to that run. Right?
Yes, could be, yeah. Could very well be.
Thank you for a great talk. I was wondering if you had looked into 2 areas. The first being the impact of the gas boom on capital for renewable energy, and the second being the subsidy, how big a subsidy it is that EPA granted oil and gas by classifying their wastes as residual waste rather than hazardous waste.
Okay, the first part of that, I'm sorry, the first part of the question was what?
Renewables.
Yeah, renewables. Did you see the study that MIT came out with? I think it was about last week. There's been so much that's come out in the last 2 weeks. They came out with a study, and basically they just said that unfortunately, because natural gas prices are so low currently, that